Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Syria, and more specifically the area around Idlib, because it seems that things are heightening up and escalating specifically in that region because we've had more direct confrontations playing out in that region. Now, we've always spoken about Syria as a country where proxy wars are playing out. A number of external forces and players are involved in that country. However, they were never directly involved in the sense that their direct forces were not in combat with each other. But that seems to be changing slowly. We've had now with the Syrian army directly, of course, in battle of sorts with the Turkish army, which is currently also in Syria at this point in time. Then the Russians are, of course, unhappy about that as well. Will there be a direct confrontation of sorts between the Russians and the Turks in Syria? What about the Americans? We've also had the Syrian army standing up to the Americans as well. And there's been one Syrian killed in that regard as well. On the Turkish versus Syria side, we've had a number of Turkish soldiers as well as Syrians also being killed in that regard. So instead of just concentrating on these specific countries, the question at ease right now, and the question that comes to mind is, are proxy wars ending in Syria? Are we going to see more direct confrontations between all of the above, possibly on Syrian soil? Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Kamran Gasanov, who is a senior lecturer at the People's Friendship University of Russia. He's joining us now from Moscow. And joining us from Ankara is Valeria Giannotta, who is an academician, expert of international relations at Türk Hava Kuruma University in Ankara itself. Valeria and Kamran, thank you both for your time today. Valeria, let me start with you. Do you believe that we are entering a new phase in Syria where we'll have just more direct confrontations?
Definitely, it's a turning point in the Syrian context. The main question that all of us is asking whether this is the beginning or the end of a regional war. Like Turkey is in the ground, and it was part of the sort of alliance between Russia and Iran within the scope of the Astana group, while nowadays, and Russia by itself and Iran were supporting the Assad regime. Of course, nowadays we are in front of such a new situation where the Syrian army from the Assad side are just targeting the Turkish soldiers, and 15 of them lost their lives very recently. What I believe is that all these new military events and development will be a part of a sort of a new diplomatic adjustment. Recently, from both the Turkish press and both the Russian press has declared that next Sunday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu, and the Russian counterpart will meet again in Munich, and they will open again the issue. We should remind that in the last days, a Russian delegation came to Ankara and discussed this issue before Jeffrey, the American advisor to the President Donald Trump, came to Ankara. So what I believe that it's not convenient from any side to come up to a direct confrontation. And Russia will play a sort of mediation role again. We should remind that the alliance between Turkey and Russia has been based on a sort of compartmental logic. So even though there are some opposite lines, but they always found the ground in Syria, as it happened recently in Libya as well, to accommodate themselves. So what shall I expect from my point of view, the sort of a new round of the negotiation process? Of course.
Okay, so if you allow me, Valeria, I just want to put that you just made there about Russia to Kamran as well. Kamran, do you think that the current disagreement, and it's quite a clear disagreement, isn't it, that Russia and Turkey are having right now at this point in time when it comes to Turkey and Russia's actions, both in Syria this time, that Russia and Turkey can work this out, considering they are already cooperating, as Valeria said, on many issues when it comes to Syria?
I think despite the situation is very serious and we have now open war between Syria and Turkey, and we know that Russia fully supports Syrian advance in Idlib because we have the terrorists, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is accepted as terrorist organization both in Turkey and Russia. But despite this conflict of interest, I think Russia and Turkey still can manage this problem as they managed many times, because in 2018, in September, the situation was also difficult, and Putin and Erdogan met in Sochi, and they agreed that we create a de-escalation zone, a demilitarized zone. But now this zone is no more existing because Assad took new territories. He took control over Sarakip as well as Marat and Noman. This is very strategic cities because one of them is on the crossroads of M4, M5 highway. And the second one, Marat and Noman, this is the second biggest city in Idlib. And now the important point is to retain contacts between Russian and Turkish defense ministries. Because if we lose this information sharing, then the results will be very negative and up to the situation we had in 2015 when Turkey downed Russian jet.
Okay, let me add another voice to this conversation. We're now also joined by Hakkı, Öcal, who is a political analyst and instructor at the Ibn Khaldun University. He's joining us now from Istanbul. Hakkı, we appreciate your time and for joining us here in Scope. Do you think, Hakkı, that there will actually be some sort of direct confrontation or a lowering of relations somehow between Turkey and Russia because of Syria? Or do you think it will be, as one of our guests mentioned earlier, Valeria, that this will just mean more negotiations?
I don't think so. I mean, it is simply a lack of control on the part of Putin. He cannot control Bashar Assad anymore. Bashar thinks that Russian hands are tied now. They have to support him and his murderous system. So they all by themselves decided to move and get rid of those what they call terrorists, which are actually terrorists or equipped and trained by the United States, even though they look like very extreme radical Muslim terrorists, but they are actually American terrorists. All of a sudden, he decided to get rid of them. And Putin can no longer control Bashar Assad there. Putin, like the United States, cannot commit more ground troops in that area. So he has to, at one point, come to terms with Turkey and allow Turkey to move on to Bashar Assad forces so that thus they are going to teach something to Bashar Assad that, look, you don't have anyone but us. I think in very short time, in 2 or 3 days, there will be a new Turkish-Russian agreement, and it is going to solve this problem for time being. I mean, they are not going to solve anything at all. I mean, there are terrorists there, and nobody likes them at all.
Hakkı, if I may put a very question to you, do you think that Bashar al-Assad's forces are right to want to take the whole country? Because, their argument, of course, as you well know, is that Syria is a sovereign country and it should have, the government in Damascus should have control throughout the country, even Idlib.
Yes, you're right. I mean, he wants that. It's strange enough, Turkey also wants that. I mean, for the last 8 years, I didn't hear anything but territorial integrity of Syria from the Turkish mouth. So nobody is ever going to, on Turkish side, of course, going to dismember Syria or Iraq, to this matter, and there will be no problem whatsoever. However, for the time being, there is this American plot going on in the country. Americans are trying to dismember Syria into 3 parts, and unfortunately, Bashar Assad, not only a murderous regime, but also not very clear regime. They are free of any rationality anymore. They simply want to try to their hands on Turkish part. They have their country's 40%, including their oil reserves and everything, in the hands of Turkish PKK terrorists and United States forces, and they are trying to get rid of only those handful of Muslim people, women and children in Idlib. They are stupid. I mean, Turkey is not going to allow them to force another 4 million into Turkey. This is not a good way for Saddam. He cannot eventually get rid of all the opposition and have whole country to himself. Nobody is ever going to allow him to do that.
Okay.
But again, it is Bashar Assad who is right now seems to be the problem.
All right, Valeria, let me bring you back. I'll ask you two questions, Valeria. Firstly, of course, about the question of Idlib. Do you think that Turkey has the answer for how that situation should be resolved? Because it needs to be resolved at some point. I mean, it seems that we keep kicking the can down the road. And Idlib, I mean, even at the time when all of those evacuations from certain areas of the country were happening and all these militant groups or whoever were being sent to Idlib, the question was always what then would happen to Idlib? And then secondly, what do you make of America's involvement at this point in time in Syria as well?
Yes, let me start from the first question about Idlib. Assad is surrounding almost and conquering almost the 50% of the Idlib province. So basically, he's on the ground and keeping conquering. I mean, putting his flag on Idlib. I think after the negotiations that we spoke before, Turkey may take a serious stance against the Islamist groups that actually are sort of jihadist groups as well that they are supporting in Idlib. The second biggest issue on the ground in Idlib is the humanitarian crisis. I mean, we counted almost 1 million of people are already displaced from Idlib, and around 400,000 people are pushing towards the Turkish border. And here it comes the strong need from Turkey to contain again the flow of immigrants coming from Syria to Turkey and to create the so-called safe zone. That actually was the first plan along the military incursion that it happened occurred lastly in October 2018. I mean, after the Peace Spring operation, one of the main targets was to create a safe zone with the two aims. First, sort of containment of the terrorist threat, and the second point was just to the dislocating or contain and the refugees as well, or sending them back from Turkey to Syria.
Yeah.
So I think actually they have to negotiate because Turkey is suffering a lot, even though the President Erdogan is escalating his tone, saying we will retaliate, it will be a military defeat on the ground. Coming to U.S., U.S. has interest, of course, in Syria, as Russia has, from an hegemonic regional point of view. Of course, this crisis, as we witnessed yesterday, helped to sort of appease the conversation between U.S. and Turkey. But, in my opinion, some element of friction still are on the table. I mean, we remember that Turkey just applied a sort of military cooperation with Russia, and it purchased the S-400 missile system, and this created a sort of spillover effect in the collaboration with U.S. I mean, to the extent that Turkey was expelled by the F-35 programs. And already in Syria there is this very dividing issue, which is the support granted by the Americans to the Kurdish militias, the YPG, which is considered a terrorist organization from Turkey.
Okay, so let me just, I do sincerely apologize for interrupting you once again, Valeria. Unfortunately, the clock is getting the best of us. Kamran, just under a minute if you can. What do you make of the U.S. involvement? There have been those direct clashes, of course, between Assad's forces and American troops as well.
I think for the United States, the priority is Euphrates, where they have military presence, and they moved from east to west, from North Territories there, because there was a deal between Turkey, USA, Turkey, and Russia. So they will retain their forces there, extract oil, and keep the control over territories which controlled now by YPG. As for Idlib, I think for them it doesn't matter because the United States is not Europe. They don't fear migrants, and the refugees will come to Turkey and to Europe, not to the United States. One thing for them is important is to make relations between Turkey and Russia as much worse as it possible, and showing their support to Turkey. But at least I think they will make the same thing as they made 2015. They didn't help them that time to Turkey.
Okay, we'll leave there as a final word. There's a lot more ground to cover, but we hope we were able to give viewers a well-rounded point of view on that. We'll thank all of our guests, Kamran, Valeria, and Hakkı, for their time and, of course, for their insight. It seems what we're agreeing upon right now and what we've spoken about with our guests is that Turkey and Russia can possibly work out their differences as they currently stand in Syria, but then the Americans seem to be the odd ones out at this point in time. The Americans are the ones who are the spanner in the works. Will they seek to further divide Turkey and Russia and then destroy, in some ways, the Astana process. What then happens to Idlib? Because that remains very much an open question, as I'd put to our guests as well. That needs to be resolved at some point. Everyone can't just keep kicking the can down the road. Something needs to be resolved when it comes to Idlib. The Syrian government, i.e. the Assad government, would argue it's all Syrian territory. They should have sovereign control over it. Will all of the above respect that? Will that actually happen? Or will something else happen? We'll have to wait and see, of course. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the United Nations Human Rights Office, which has issued a list, essentially a blacklist, if we can call it that, of 112 companies that work in illegal Israeli settlements, illegal, of course, under international law, as we've all understood it. Now, this doesn't come out of the blue or in a vacuum. The list was, in fact, mandated by the UN Human Rights Council back in 2016 and has been so long delayed that it's now being released in 2020. Yet, of course, as we would expect, the Israelis have reacted quite negatively, saying that whoever boycotts us will be boycotted. That's a direct quote of Benjamin Netanyahu. The Palestinians see this as a victory, especially of international law, understandably. Now, one of the important things to mention here as well is that one of the companies, in fact, blacklisted is Airbnb. And it's something that many people around the world would use whenever vacationing in any respective country or city around the world. But I mention it because, in fact, Airbnb last year tried to walk away from these Israeli settlements, but then was sued and then backtracked. And that, again, goes to show the strength, possibly, of those anti-BDS laws. And BDS, of course, standing for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, which many Palestinians refer to and use, and even those who are pro-Palestine refer to as putting pressure then on the Israeli occupation. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Khalil Jahshan, who is the Executive Director of the Arab Center for Washington, D.C., an independent think tank focusing on developments in the Arab world and U.S. foreign policy. He's joining us now from Washington. And joining us from Ramallah is Mustafa Barghouti, who is a Palestinian politician. Thank you to both of you for your time today. Mustafa Barghouti, if I may, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this blacklist, as it's been called? Of course, it's created waves for the Israelis, and the Americans are also quite angry about it.
It's a very important issue. It's a very important declaration, especially that it comes after 3 years of hesitations and a lot of American and Israeli pressure on the United Nations not to publish this list. In my opinion, it has two very important consequences. First, it's a blow to the so-called the deal of the century of Mr. Trump. It shows that the world community is not controlled by Mr. Trump or his administration, and that his deal of a century is really isolated. On the other hand, the provision of this list will provide the BDS movement, the boycott campaigns, with a very strong instrument, because all these 112 companies will be now subjected not only to boycott, but also to the very powerful instrument of divestment. I'm sure that Airbnb will be forced to leave the settlements as SodaStream did before because of the boycott campaigns. There are at least 16 companies who are from different countries, like 6 from the United States, 4 from Holland, 3 from Britain, 2 from France, 1 from Luxembourg. And they will all be subjected not only to boycott, but also to the possibility of legal actions because they are violating international law by being inside Israeli settlements.
All right, so Khalil Jahshan, ask you, in fact, about that, because as I'd mentioned in my introduction as well, and I'd use the example of Airbnb, and I'm sure you know this case well, that Airbnb had to backtrack on its initial decision last year at some point to walk away from those Israeli settlements. It seems that this anti-BDS movement is quite strong as well, especially in the U.S., isn't it?
Unfortunately, it is. It is picking up steam here by encouragement, of course, from the administration and from many in Congress. The battle has moved its center of gravity, if you will, from Washington away into the periphery. Local states now and cities have been engaged because it's frankly easier for the anti-BDS campaign to function at the local level, where the commitment to civil rights is not as strong as it is in Washington, D.C., and with all due respect, where people tend to be, officials tend to be maybe less aware of the civil rights implications of this. So yes, and of course the fact that the administration is seeking beyond some of the policies that anti-Palestinian policies that it has adopted and implemented over the past couple of years. It is seeking to change even the whole terms of reference, the whole even legal background of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly the policy vis-a-vis Palestine, to the detriment of Palestinian rights.
So, Mustafa, what do you think the next Palestinian move should be at this point in time? I mean, you've spoken about, of course, what the effect on these companies will possibly be right now. But as you well know, both the Israelis and the Americans have essentially walked away from the UN Human Rights Council, right? So how much teeth does this sort of decision really have at this point, realistically, then?
Well, actually, it's funny because I cannot remember the number of times that the United States and Israel said they are walking away from the Council of Human Rights. I mean, they've done that so many times before, they boycotted before, but that means nothing because the Council continues to work. Our campaign will concentrate on three aspects: boycotting the companies that work in settlements, exercising very big public pressure on them. The second line would be to go to major banks and major investment portfolios to force them to divest from these companies. And we have had success in this regard among many American churches, the Norwegian Investment Fund, etc. So that will hurt these companies a lot, including the Israeli companies, especially those that have international businesses like the Israeli banks and the communication companies. The third line we will use is to have people in some countries like Britain and Holland take some of these companies to court, sue them for the violation of international law. So the combination of these three elements would probably force many of these companies to get out of the Israeli illegal settlements, and that by itself would be an important step in supporting Palestinian struggle against the illegal Israeli actions and against what has become the worst system of apartheid in modern history. Because what Israel has created and what Trump is advocating is nothing but a system of apartheid, discrimination, and racial oppression. So we are going to use this list very well. We are happy that it was published. It took a very long time, 3 years, because of American pressure, but finally we got it, and we thank Ms. Bicholet for being courageous enough to refuse American pressure.
Khalil, Jahshan, the reason I asked about how much teeth or what kind of teeth this decision really has is because the Israel's Strategic Affairs Minister, Gilad Erdan, told the Jerusalem Post just on Thursday that, in fact, all of these companies realize, as I'd mentioned to you in my first question to you about the anti-BDS laws in many states across the U.S., that they would lose money, in fact, right? They don't want to lose out on the American market, certainly. It's a huge market, and there's a lot of money to be made there. Do you think that sort of just hangs over all of this as a shadow? All businesses want to make money at the end of the day, don't they?
Undoubtedly. I think the magic, if you will, of this step, including, of course, the list and the steps that were delineated by Dr. Mustafa a minute ago, these tend to hamper the ability of some of these companies, if not all of them, to move in and out of the territories and to conduct business without restrictions. Essentially, these are tools of the capitalist system. They are part of capitalism. And restrictions basically are the enemy. They are the main impediment for the free flow of goods and people. And if that is the case, if they are indeed implemented in such an effective way, these companies are going to suffer, and they are going to suffer in the territories, and they are going to suffer internationally, because frankly, most of these companies are international. They have no local loyalty to anybody except to themselves and to making an extra buck, to making profit. Otherwise, they are dead in the water.
Indeed. Mustafa Barghouti, I'll get a final from you. As you well know, all of these sorts of decisions are immediately labeled anti-Semitic, and that has happened even this time around also by many Israeli officials. Is it anti-Semitic to release such a list, A? And B, do you think that this does increase then hatred and lessens the possibility of actual peace?
These are silly accusations, but they are used by Israel all the time. Anybody who opposes Israeli policy and Israeli occupation and Israeli apartheid is classified as anti-Semitic, sometimes as a terrorist. Even Jewish people who are supporting Palestinian people, and I've just heard about a new group at Harvard University of Jewish law students who decided to stand up to the Israeli apartheid system. Even Jewish people are accused of being self-hating Jews by the Israeli establishment. These are accusations that mean nothing to us. We are not against Jewish people or Israeli people per se. We are against the Israeli policies, we are against the Israeli occupation, and we are against the Israeli apartheid. As a matter of fact, I think our struggle, which is difficult sometimes and which is hard frequently, is a struggle not only for the future of Palestinians, but also of Jewish Israelis and of Jewish people in general, because no Jewish person could be or should be proud of creating a system of apartheid in the 21st century. They will not be free unless we are free. And that's why I think those who believe in humanity will always be on our side and will not believe these stupid accusations by the Israeli establishment.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final. We do appreciate both of our guests for their time. Khalil, Jahshan, they're speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and Mustafa Barghouti was speaking to us from Ramallah. Now, viewers, what we've essentially agreed upon is that these companies will now be under pressure, won't they? Because it's been brought out in the open that they are working in illegal Israeli settlements. As I said, illegal under international law. That's something that cannot be denied, however much the Americans and Israelis would say that they don't agree with it. But nevertheless, that is what the international community views it as at this point in time, at least. These settlements are built illegally at this point in time, at least. What will these companies do? Because for them, it's about their bottom line, right? Like Khalil Jahshan said. So what will they do when this pressure now has come upon them and they need to look after their bottom line? Will the Israelis be able to protect them as they've attempted to do with these many anti-BDS laws across the many U.S. states that currently have brought them forth in their respective states, punishing anybody who dares to boycott any Israeli company that does, or any company, I should say, international company even, that works in these illegal Israeli settlements, such as Airbnb or others? Or will these companies walk away? Will they have to walk away? And then what does that then mean for the BDS movement? What does that mean then for peace? What does that mean then for the illegal Israeli settlers at this point? Those are all open-ended questions which we'll keep a close eye on here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss white supremacy in the United States. Now, according to the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, white supremacist material being spread across that country, across the U.S., I should say, rose by around 120% in 2019. Now, this is the second year that the circulation of racist material has more than doubled. But at the same time, it seems that white supremacists have realized that the public image isn't that good. So, in fact, they held 20% fewer public events because they don't want to seemingly come under that sort of exposure, at least at this point in time. Nevertheless, this is dangerous. Even the FBI director is admitting at this time that the national security threat that is posed by racist extremists within the United States is at par with the danger that Islamic State presents. And that is, I'm sure, not something that he is saying lightly. So what does all of this mean? Essentially, they're trying to normalize, by targeting, it seems, university campuses and others with this sort of material, hatred towards minority groups, including Jews, African Americans, Muslims, non-white immigrants, and a whole bunch of other marginalized communities within the United States at this time. All very dangerous, certainly. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by Sahar, Khamis, who is a professor of communication at the University of Maryland. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Also joining us from Washington is Mujtaba, Akhwand, who is the director for the Free Muslim Center for De-Radicalization and Extremism Prevention. Mujtaba and Sahar, thank you both for your time this morning. Sahar, let me start with you. What do you make of the ADL report? How worrying is it?
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I think we have a number of very serious indications here. The rise of white supremacist hatred materials and propaganda material by 120% is very alarming, but it is not a new phenomenon. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of blind spot or invisibility when it comes to this type of hatred. In fact, I disagree with the statement from the FBI director saying that it is the same threat that is posed by ISIS and other groups. In fact, a lot of research has shown that, Pew Research, Gallup Research shown that 96% or more of hate crimes and terrorist attacks committed on U.S. soil came from these extremist white supremacist groups. So only 4% or less is committed by foreign entities like Al-Qaeda or ISIS and others. So it's a disproportionate alarm and disproportionate threat and danger. Yet, this is not what we see and hear in the media. Whenever there's an attacker who does have a Muslim name or an Arab name, immediately he gets called, quote unquote, a terrorist, and the attack itself gets called an act of terrorism. If the attacker happens to be a white man, most of the time he is given the label of a shooter, an attacker, and there's justification of mental illness. So there is really a very complex, multidimensional issue where you have so many different layers of bias. You have lack of clear definition of terrorism in the case of white supremacists. You have lack of visibility. You have media bias, and you have Islamophobia. All of that obscures the threat that they actually pose.
Mujtaba, what are your thoughts on that? Because, by ignoring and or downplaying this, it's playing with fire, isn't it? Because we're sort of setting ourselves up for some major, God forbid, event which could be very violent.
Thank you for having me on your show. And I definitely agree with her. One thing has happened is there is there's a turnaround on surfacing these white supremacists, and we are more exposed to them. But throughout history of the United States or European countries, we have noticed that the white supremacy and that mentality has existed. But for the first time ever, in the past 4 or 5 years, or less, we have seen and we have noticed the surfacing of these acts. They're doing it more proudly. They're taking pride of the events that they do, the parade that they have. So on one hand, it's good that it has surfaced, but on the other hand, I don't think Muslims were equipped with social media tools to showcase these surface attacks. One thing about Muslims in general is we don't name and shame. We don't have that in our religion, and that's taken advantage of. In other faiths, if someone does something ill or something wrong, they relate that to their religion and say, okay, it was a Muslim man. They don't say it was someone from Bangladesh. It was someone from Sudan. It was someone from Ethiopia. They don't say that. They don't say someone from Iraq. But immediately, if it's someone, as you mentioned, if it's someone who is white in skin or race, it's someone from Mississippi. So you don't hear the religion aspect of it at all. Yeah. So if in general we're able to, we don't want to mention that someone is Christian or Jew or anything, because then we'll be duplicating exactly what the white supremacist is doing. So we have to reply by their ill action in a good manner. We have to show them that you don't name and shame a religion just because someone is adhering to that religion. What we're doing is we're paving the road forward. If we want to duplicate, he says this, she says, and explain everything on the religion of the person, we will be playing on their level. And Islam is much above that. Islam is a religion of forgiveness. Islam is a religion that says, even if someone is adhering to a religion, you don't say that. So this is being taken advantage of in social aspects.
All right, so Sahar, the groups that I list who are, at this point or have been targeted by white supremacists so far, as I said, include Jews, African Americans, Muslims, not white immigrants, and a whole bunch of other marginalized and minority communities in the U.S. Do you think that there's enough unity amongst all of the above to be fighting this sort of white supremacy at this time, or do you think that needs to still happen? Do you see that possibly forming?
some good steps that have been taken in this direction. For example, when the Muslim ban happened, we saw the anti-Muslim ban march here in Washington, D.C., and there were all sorts of people across all ranks, all walks of life, Jews, Christians, Muslim, black, white, immigrants, you name it, people across the board who came out, they raised banners, they said, no, this is your land, we want you here, Muslims are welcome here, we stand with you in solidarity. So there is really a rise or a surge in this type of solidarity. But definitely, of course, much more still needs to be done, because I always say that Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all of that stuff is just part and parcel of the wider problem of racism more broadly, and we cannot fight this evil alone. Every group has to unite and join hands with others in order to be able to fight this evil of racism. Let me just comment quickly on a couple of things. One thing your other guest said about naming, right? Naming and shaming. The Pope said that, I totally agree with him, we should never link a religion to an evil act of terrorism or extremism. So terms like Islamic radicalization, Islamic extremism, or Islamic terrorism, these are very, very dangerous terms to use. And unfortunately, some media, including in the Arab and Muslim world, started to use the same term, the same terminology, which is very dangerous. The Pope said, I don't want to hear about Catholic extremism or Catholic fundamentalism or Catholic terrorism, because there's no such thing. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, all religions are away from this evil of terrorism and should not be named or linked with it in any way, shape, or form. So terminology matters and words matters. And finally, targeting of young people. The report that you mentioned at the beginning said that white supremacists are really now using university campuses as their place. And this is very true. At the University of Maryland, where I've been a professor for the last 12 years, we have witnessed in the last few years a surge in white supremacist material and white supremacist propaganda, targeting especially young university students. And now the university is starting more diversity and inclusion efforts to try to make people aware of the importance of fighting this kind of hateful rhetoric.
Okay, so let me bring in another voice conversation. We're now joined from Ottawa in Canada by Mustafa Amin Farooq, who is the Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Mustafa, good morning, and thank you for joining us. Mustafa, certainly this issue of white supremacy is not unique to the United States. We've also had incidents within Canada also. We can think about the Quebec mosque shooting, and there have been other cases with the group called The Base, for example, which the FBI has also arrested a number of members of for planning violence of sorts. We've also had the Proud Boys. I mean, I can probably list a whole bunch of groups. Tell us about how white supremacy is being perceived within Canada also, and do you think that there is enough understanding there that this sort of maybe coming over from the border, and it is and should be alarming to Canadians also?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, thank you for having me on your show. I'm actually joining you from an airport on my way to fly to Calgary to talk more about white supremacy and the dangers that it poses. In fact, in Calgary, it was not so long ago when white supremacists showed up at Calgary City Hall with stun guns in their hands to intimidate peaceful protesters. The reality is that while the Canadian government has taken some steps to address white supremacist organizations, for example, last year there was the banning of the neo-Nazi, alt-right group Combat 18 and Blood and Honor, but there are also numerous other organizations that are active in the Canadian scene. For example, the 3%ers, which are a group largely based in Alberta, Saskatchewan. They have live ammo training, and they practice for a apocalyptic showdown with the Canadian Muslim community. We're calling on the federal government to use sections of the criminal code to halt them in their actions because they pose an existential threat to the Canadian Muslim community. I mean, I was just in Quebec City for the marking of the January 29, 2017 Quebec City mosque attack that murdered 6 of our brothers. This is not something that's going away, and it's something that we have to be very carefully watching.
Mustafa, I'm going to give you the final word, just a minute if you can. In a country like Canada, which prides itself so much on multiculturalism, why do you think it is that white supremacy is rising? I mean, the same question can be asked about the U.S. too, but I mean, in Canada, in cities like Toronto and otherwise, where there is so much multiculturalism, I mean, I grew up there, so it's hard to believe that there is this sort of feeling. Why do you think, what do you think is at the root of all this?
Well, I mean, I think we have to be careful and cautious in, and this is a bit of the academic in me, in sort of narrowly determining a single cause for why there is a growth of far-right, alt-right Islamophobic organizations in Canada. That's why we need to study it more. We need more research. We need more study. We need more discussion, like what you and I are having. Because the reality is that we're just not talking about it enough. Despite the fact that these organizations are alive, they're growing, they're active, they're mobilizing, they're training, we simply aren't doing enough to stop it.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word. Appreciate all three of our guests for their time this morning. That was Mustafa speaking to us from an airport in Ottawa, Sahar, who was speaking to us from Washington, and also speaking to us from Washington was Mujtaba. Now, as we've put into context for you viewers, this issue of white supremacy is not just an issue limited to the United States. However, it's ADL and other groups in the U.S. which have at least put this down into statistic form. So we know it's rising there, 120% rise from 2018 to 2019. Even in 2018, there was the more than doubling of racist propaganda by white supremacist groups specifically targeted towards university campuses. They are targeting the younger minds at this point in time, so they're able to then form that sort of hatred towards migrant communities, Jews, African Americans, anybody else who is marginalized in some form or the other within the U.S. And now, as I put to Mustafa as well, within Canada also, we are seeing a rise of this even in places which are multicultural. So it's really important to have these statistics out there. It's really important for these governments to actually put this into context. As Sahar had also said, in fact, white supremacist and domestic terrorism is much higher, even statistically, than what would be labeled as by the mainstream media as quote unquote Islamic terrorism. That's something which most people, I would imagine, within the US and Canada do not actually realize when it comes to this discussion of extremism. We'll leave it there for that. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.